West Side or now, but excited to be out here with you all here at the main branch of Mentor Public Library for a little discussion on our India Pale Ales. We did a program, some of you, I believe, were at the Zoom program that we did back in December, right before the holidays. That was a little bit more of a broad overview, some stuff like how to taste and so on. This one, and there was beer at that one, which was one of my favorite programs, and this guy was the host, right? John's over there. And one of my favorite programs I've ever done, because there's actually beer there, which was fantastic, right? So, but this one will be a little bit more lecture style, so. But, you know, I have knowledge that I want to share with you all, and it's super interesting stuff, but at the same time, I know everyone always has a lot of their own questions too, so please, throughout the course of the lecture, if you will, don't be shy, throw your hand up, ask whatever you want to ask about. We got plenty of time, so I'm happy to answer anything you got. Just a quick intro for me. For those of you who weren't here last time, or if you're watching, you know, via the YouTube channel later on, I didn't catch the last one. So, Mike Williams, as previously mentioned, I've been at Great Lakes for a decade this October, which is fantastic. I got my start there as a busser. Figured this craft beer thing's pretty cool. And try to figure out something career-wise here. Started serving. Was essentially doing sales and marketing on the floor, right, in the pub. Shifted over into the marketing department, giving tours of our brewery. And then was really able to tap into my passion as an educator. When basically a role opened up where I was able to take on all of our staff trainings, working with our business partners like distributors and major retail partners, training them about who we are at Great Lakes, what we're all about, what our beers taste like, you name it, all that kind of stuff. And I've been in that role ever since, and I picked up other marketing functions since then, like anyone subscribe to our Much A Brew newsletter? If you do not, sign up for it. I pen that one. Any blogs you see on our website, stuff like that. I'm able to channel my educational passion through all those other channels as well. So it's what I do. I love doing this. This is my favorite stuff, is to just nerd out about beer with people. So thanks for being here and absorbing some knowledge this evening. So we're going to talk about the wide spectrum of India Pale Ales. And we're going to look at, for each one of these takes, we're going to look at history. There's some really cool history behind all these different takes on India Pale Ale. We'll look at some suggested sensory guidelines for these various IPAs. And I use the Beer Judge Certification Program for my teaching efforts. It's basically, if you're a home brewer, anyone homebrew here in the room? Nice! That's like half the people, yeah. So you're probably familiar with BJCP. If you're not, though, it's basically the guidelines that homebrewers use, homebrew competitions use for judging. Because you got to have some sort of shared language, right, to talk about the beers that are being judged. Also, doubles is a really good educational tool for talking about sensory. So I'll mention, we'll go over those together. And of course, we're going to be looking at these two major things through the lens of the various beers that we make at Great Lakes. So I'll start off by introing our brand, I think. Yep. And then then we'll go through the history, the background stuff, and come back and kind of look and see, okay, how does the GLBC brand kind of like very well personify what this style is supposed to be about. Okay? And of course, can't have beer at the library today, but if you whip up a thirst, I think you know where to find us. You can find us pretty much everywhere, but we do have the beer finder tool on the website that you can use, greatlakesbrewing.com/beer-finder. Let's say a certain store is out of stock of Tropicoastal or something, you want to track it down somewhere else, use that tool to help you track it down. But walk into a Heinen's or Giant Eagle and you're going to be good. So we're going to start with Hazecraft. And we'll talk about hazy IPAs. Hazy IPAs, as I'm sure a few all are generally familiar with craft beer / are brewing it. You know, hazy IPAs are kind of the big deal in IPA and in craft beer generally. So we'll look at that first as a great way to start off this discussion. But first, intro of our particular version of a hazy to get us started, Hazecraft IPA. This one, along with the next one we'll talk about, is relatively new for us. It's a beer that came out about a year and a half ago, in August of 2020. Lovely time to launch a new beer. But we really wanted to get some, and I'll talk a little bit as we go too about kind of the business side of stuff for why we're doing what we're doing at Great Lakes too. So for now, just the basics, right? Just to be totally clear, definition of terms, ABV, of course, is what? What is ABV? Someone answer from the crowd.
Alcohol by volume.
Alcohol by volume, yeah. So pretty easy, it measures how much potency that liquid has. IBU, who's got that one? International Bitterness Unit, yep. Which specifically, this number here, it's usually between, you see a number between 20 to 80 generally. The scale theoretically goes as, in the hundreds, but you don't see too many options like that. And that's the measure of the scientific bitterness of the beer, so how much bittering compound is present in the liquid. Now, other factors may then affect how much of that bitterness is perceived. And some of those factors would be things like the grain. So in Hazecraft, we use oats and wheat. I'm not going to get too far ahead of myself here, but those are going to come into play for how hazy IPAs generally are going to taste, especially how it interacts with the bitterness. So in beer, for our malts, those are grains. The first one, two-row base malt, that's our primary source of sugars for fermentation. Of course, we have to give sugar to yeast cells so they'll produce alcohol and CO2 for us. And then all the other grains we add in for various other color and flavor considerations. Hops then being the spice of beer, if you will, where we're adding complementary notes such as bitterness, and then a wide array of flavors and aromas that in the modern day are generally going to be in the tropical fruit realm, stone fruit, and things like that. So for Hazecraft, that's what we got. And I will talk a little bit more about how this all comes together after we look at the style overall. See how it kind of fits in. But I wanted to use that as an opportunity just to establish some terms. So history. Hazy IPA. Now hazy IPAs often have a different name, and they especially did in their first, let's say, 10, 12 years of existence. New England Ipa is a name you'll often see used for what we now typically refer to as a hazy IPA. So this beer was first brewed in upstate Vermont. One of the earliest examples was made by this guy right here, named Greg Noonan, who also looks a lot like Trey Anastasio from Fish, but also happens to be from upstate Vermont. Just creepy, right? Big Fish fan. Don't judge me, right?
Ever seen them two in the same place?
Right. I've never seen both of them in the same place, right? Yeah, right. Anyways, so he brewed at Vermont Pub and Brewery, kind of small, just brew pub style place in upstate Vermont, and he was making a wide array of different beers, but he was making some extremely hop forward beers. They were so hop forward, he would dump so many hops into these beers that they ended up having a haze to them. And today, no one would blink an eye at that. They might actually blink an eye if it were clear half the time these days, right? But back in the 90s, that was like, whoa, beer is supposed to be clear, man, right? We're all used to, really so at that point, so informed by all the German lagers that came before us, and those beers are meant to be brilliantly clear. And early craft beer followed that pattern. So Noonan had a lot of criticism for the haze in his beers. But he would say, who cares? These beers taste really good. Who cares what they look like? And that was reported by his assistant brewer, John Kimmick. And John Kimmick, like hundreds and hundreds of assistant brewers before him, said, I want to start my own brewery. So he went off and did. And he started a place called The Alchemist. Who has heard of The Alchemist? Anyone heard of The Alchemist? Yeah? Who loves that heady topper, right? Alchemist, very well renowned for making hop forward style beers, also of course from upstate Vermont. And he was doing the same thing that his mentor Noonan was doing, creating these beers with maximum amount of hop flavor and aroma. Necessary kind of process nut for doing this, these beers are going to be unfiltered, unpasteurized, whereas some craft beers might be filtered in some way. And again, the haze that's coming into these beers is there because of the intense hopping rate. However, big key is that the beers aren't hazy for their own sake. They're hazy because of the maximum amount of hops that are being used. Now, that sometimes gets flipped a little bit on its head today. For calling a beer a hazy IPA, we do kind of expect it to be hazy. So this beer, Heady Topper, legendary kind of big, double hazy IPA. Originally, you had to go all the way up there to upstate Vermont to get this beer. It was only served on tap. That was a way to preserve the quality and freshness of the product, and also from the business side, you make a lot more money that way too. So you had to go all the way up there until about 2011. And in August of 2011, the Alchemist was more or less forced to start canning this beer, and that's because, I don't know if you remember, this is a decade ago at this point, and I can't recall which storm it was exactly, but I believe one of the hurricanes moved its way up the East Coast and stalled over New England, and just dumped crazy amounts of rain on all New England and totally wiped out the Alchemist brewery. So they had to pretty much start over. And so to pay back the debt that they owed more quickly, they wanted to ramp up real quick. You know, they had to build a new brewery anyway, so make a bigger one and start canning this product, and they can sell it in a lot more places. And right around the same time, things like online forums like Beer Advocate were becoming popular. Social media like Instagram and all that, it seems like it's been with us forever, but it's only been about a decade, 15 years or so. And so on started to come into everyday life for beer consumers. And so now there's this beer that is starting to get some availability, and there's a lot of a way to share it, and boom, demand for this beer just blows up like crazy. Totally insane. It's all by free marketing too. So others started producing this hazy IPA as well. Sean Hill, who was right in line behind the assistant brewer who says, I can do my own brewery too, is the home brewing regular who says, I can start my own brewery as well. So Sean Hill, who is a regular at Kimmick's place, says, I want to start a brewery as well. He opens up Hill Farmstead in right around 2010. And these are kind of three of the original just kind of grandfathers, if you will, of hazy IPAs. And Hill Farmstead makes awesome beer across the board, in addition to hazy IPAs. Now, these brewers are, for the most part, outside of some very limited packaging, they're operating this taproom self-distribution model, which, again, as I kind of jumped the gun a little bit with, that allows for this full control of their own products, so they're able to protect the integrity of these beers, keep them in prime condition. That was something that was very unusual at the time. It's something we take for granted. It's the way, we have 9,000 breweries in this country now, and like most of them operate that way. But back then, just a decade ago, when we had, 2,000, 2,500 breweries, still a lot, but nowhere close to what we have today, not many of them had their own tap rooms and all that. So kind of an interesting note right there. And as we see hazy IPAs rise, we also see the rise of tap rooms and all that. Early 2010s, we have some other hazy IPA producers come around. Basically, they start moving from Vermont and start working their way down. So in Massachusetts, Treehouse and Trillium open up. Some other big names. I graduated from Boston College in 2010. Come on, those guys couldn't open a year or two earlier, right? I missed out on all that, right? So, right around the same time, these are all the factors that made, this is all the stuff why hazy IPAs blew up like they did. And this is one of the big ones. Right around this time period as we move into the second decade of this millennium, hop farmers are able to supply brewers with some rather different and unique hop varietals. So up to this point, most hops in the United States were bred for alpha acid content. That's that bittering compound that gives us IBUs. And large brewers just wanted high alpha acid content hops so they could use the least amount of hops possible to get the marginal amount of bitterness they needed in their mass-produced beers. Well, thanks to relationships that craft brewers had with hop farmers over the decades, hop breeders start kind of shifting. Keep hearing, we want fruit flavors and aromas and stuff coming from our hops. So they start shifting their breeds to move away from bittering content to essential oil content, which is going to produce flavors and aromas. So all these crazy hops start coming out around 2010. Citra, Galaxy's from Australia, but still. Mosaic, and the list goes on. These hops that are used in hazy IPAs a ton all start coming out right around the early 2010s, late 2000s, early 2010s. And people like this a lot, right? Bitterness is not something that we typically seek out. biologically, it indicates that something will probably be harmful to us, right? We're not wired to like bitterness. It's an acquired taste. I love bitter stuff, but it's an acquired taste. But fruit flavors are something that's totally natural to us. It's hunter-gatherer stuff. This is going to give me sugar. It's going to give me life and all that. So no big surprise that when we move from very bitter forward IPAs, which we saw before the 2010s, to these hazy IPAs that focus on fruit flavors, it's no surprise that they become very popular. We start moving to the latter part of the 2010s. Continue to see the growth in this style through various means. And what starts happening at this point, so we start to see hazies start to move outside of New England now. A lot of small tap rooms, I think I mentioned it. I'll mention it here. We start to see small tap rooms open up all over the country. It was right around 2015, 2016 that we had our own boom here in Cleveland. Basically from 2014 to 2017, all these small guys open up all over town. And they're all brewing hazy IPAs because it's something that guys like us were not doing. And there's already a lot of momentum behind the popularity of this style. But what the problem that brings up is that we don't have a lot of shared language yet as to what a hazy IPA is supposed to be, right? So, because we don't have a BJCP guideline for it. There's no GABF, Great American Beer Festival category for it and so on. And so you see some brewers, unfortunately some brewers are making something that kind of looks like, dirty bath water, and it's like hop burn and stuff. It's very astringent. It's like, rightfully so, a lot of my buddies who had a little bit of tenure in the brewing industry are like, this isn't a real beer style and stuff, because there were some less than quality examples out there, unfortunately. But there are a lot of really good ones too. And by the time we get more to around 2018, just because of the sheer popularity of this style and because there are so many quality examples out there, finally do get some shared language written by brewing authorities about what a hazy IPA is supposed to be. The pivotal moment for why that happened was at the 2017 GABF. And for those of you who don't know, the Great American Beer Festival is basically the benchmark beer fest in the United States. Happens every year in Denver. The judging even happened the past 2 years here during the pandemic and everything, so it's a really, really big deal. There's a festival attached to it normally. The festival, all of the winners in the IPA category were classic, bitter, clear, a little bit of maltiness, piney, that kind of IPA, but everybody at the festival was lining up for the hazy IPAs. And judges would say, these beers are delicious, but I can't give it a good score based on what this style is supposed to be. So then the Brewers Association and BJCP finally say, okay, we're writing our own style guidelines for hazy IPA, which is great because now we have a shared language for what a hazy IPA generally is supposed to be, what the consumer can expect, and so on. That kind of helps legitimize the style on a mass scale. There's obviously already a lot of pent-up demand for it, and so a lot of the larger players start coming out with hazies around 2018. I'd say it's about a minimum 50% of the classes I teach. I mentioned Sierra Nevada because they are the grandfathers of American craft beer. But they're still right on it. They came out with really one of the first truly widely distributed hazy IPAs and hazy little thing. Boston Beer, the Sam Adams brand comes out with a hazy around 2018 as well. Obviously putting a ton of work into it too. 100 test batches of that beer before they released it. Striking with this hazy little thing, and just shows you how much staying power the hazy has, is that in 1 year it becomes 10% of their overall sales for a million barrel brewery. Totally insane. So yeah, hazy is not going anywhere. IPAs generally aren't going anywhere. This is our buddy Bart Watson, the economist at the Brewers Association. Hazy IPA is basically the current, so he's asked every year, what's the next big thing in craft beer? And for the past 6, 7, 8 years, Bart has said IPA, 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 because it is, it just continues to be. I have a chart for you all towards the end of the lecture that demonstrates that. But right now it's hazy IPA. The question is, what's the next big thing in IPA? We'll talk about that. We have our own proposition for what that may be, and that will be the next beer we talk about. That was a little bit of sensory for you. Of course, appearance is important for a beer that is very explicitly branded as a hazy IPA. Most importantly, it's supposed to be hazy in some form, though, as I was kind of tongue-in-cheek referencing before, there's a certain quality of haze that should be there. It shouldn't be cloudy, murky. You shouldn't have hop particulate floating around in that, right? Consistent haze, but not turbid, if you will. Otherwise, color, most IPAs tend to be in the kind of like gold to deep amber type range. Just curious, for the people in the room, I know hazies have been around for a couple of years now, but are there people who don't care for IPAs in the room? Or are we mostly IPA fans? And is there a quality about IPA that...
Well, I don't like the hazy.
Oh, you don't like the hazies? Okay, so it's the other way around, yeah. So I would ask this question typically, I'd be like, most people don't like IPAs because of the bitterness, right? And so that's something that's very different about the hazy, is that brewers of hazy IPAs very intentionally lower IBU content, so there's less bitterness. But then there are also some people who don't like hazies as well because they don't have enough, right? I love hazies, but I need a little bit of bitterness in them to make them really drinkable. So, mouthfeel. Relatively full mouthfeel for the IPA, the general IPA family. And that is in thanks to some of the grains that we use. I mentioned that Hazecraft has oats and wheat. Oats and wheat will leave a lot of residual protein in the finished beer, and those proteins are what create mouthfeel. So the more of those you have, the more body you're going to get, and what that's going to do is help balance out the IBU content you get from alpha acids. That's why the oats and wheat, and the wheat also adds, proteins will also add the haze to the beer as well. Helps out in addition to polyphenols coming from hops. Very complex beer style to brew. I mean, it can be as easy as you want to make it, but. Okay, malt and hop flavors and aromas. Generally across the board for all of these beer styles, we're focusing on hops, certainly. You might get a little bit of malt character in a hazy, not a ton, just kind of like a tiny bit of bready sweetness in the background. But anything that's approaching toast or caramel or anything like that, that's too much. Don't go that far. Just malt profile is there, like for most IPAs, to support what's going on with the hops. And for hazy IPAs, they really hone in on tropical fruit, stone fruit, some citrus qualities, which are coming from contemporary hops as opposed to piney resinous stuff that comes from more old school hops. You could do a hazy that way, but that's not typically how you see them. And just tons of it, right? Tons of that hop flavor and aroma. High to very high amounts of flavor and aroma, but lower perceived bitterness. And that's pretty much what we got overall. Intense fruit flavors and aromas, soft body, smooth mouthfeel. Of course, substantial amount of haze. And then that juicy character that a lot of my brewing friends also got crotchety about back in the day. What does juicy mean? It's like you're eating a piece of fruit, right? Yeah, it's funny. I started talking about this beer, like 2 years ago, and already like there's so much more acceptance about what a hazy IPA is, even from just 2010 to now. So cool to see. We always put up the vital stats for a beer style as well. You see there's a lot of, there's a very broad range of ABV and IBU here, but BJCP didn't account for regular strength and imperial strength. So I would say a typical ABV range for a hazy is really more like 6 to 7.5%. And then an imperial hazy IPA would be a lot more. Now this is our regular hazy IPA. We did put out an imperial hazy this past summer called Tidal Fury. Anyone see Tidal Fury this past year? It's got crazy Poseidon-like dude holding a trident, and I assume he's calling down lightning and not getting struck by lightning, but it's close, right? We use a hop called Trident in that, so that's what inspired that. It's an excellent beer. That's going to come out in May this year, so keep an eye out for it. Part of our Imperial IPA series, so we do every 2 months we come out with a different Imperial IPA. Lake Erie Monster's out now. People are kind of used to that one coming out over the summer, but we wanted to try some new stuff in the summer, and Monster's got that kind of nice kind of caramely sweet backbone to it, which really works well for the winter. So keep an eye out for Monster. It's out right now. Those are all 16-ounce can 4-packs too. So it's 15 degrees out. A pint of an Imperial IPA is not going to hurt you, right? So Hazecraft, doesn't fit the bill in that kind of ABV and IBU range that we're looking for. You see, 25 to 60. 60 is kind of high for really a hazy IPA. So 40 is kind of right in the middle. ABV is in the good range. And where are we tasting right now? I would argue that we'd be tasting a lot of stuff like honeydew melon, cantaloupe, a little bit of course, the passion fruit and mango in there. Like most hazy IPAs, they'll have some notes of that. That's kind of the sensory stuff that I get from our Hazecraft, and that's coming from, again, that really cool combo of contemporary American hops that we use in this beer. So Azacca, Lemon Drop, Simcoe is about a decade old, maybe a little bit older than that. And then Mosaic, so all relatively new hops that achieve those tropical and stone fruit flavors that we're looking for in the style. All these beers, all the 4 of these beers we're talking about today, year-rounders. You can, of course, we're in home territory here, so you guys can find them everywhere. You know where to find it. But none of these are seasonal or anything like that. You can find any of them all the time. And then a note, a lot of our classic beers have rich stories of the Great Lakes behind them, right? So Elliot Ness, Evan Fitzgerald, Burning River, Commodore Perry, and so on. A lot of our newer beers have had a less explicit link to that, simply just because of, the way that people buy beer and share beer and stuff like that changes all the time, really, but, kind of 5 to 10 year chunks and all that. So we still try to weave in some Ohio connections and stuff while we can. There's a little bit of a reference to the fact that we've had, 25 astronauts born in Ohio, pretty impressive. But at the same time, Hazecraft, first of all, I think when we were looking through trademarks, we're like, really? No one's taken Hazecraft? That's awesome. So, because it's kind of too easy to name, right? There are already a lot of hazies out there at that point. So we got the name, and then you thought, action-filled image that has that central figure. You'll notice that a lot of the new labels really focus on action and having that centered imagery, very bright colors. Where a lot of the old packaging had a lot of black and white and stuff like that. It was kind of hard to see on a shelf and things. So just a little bit of background on the marketing side of things for you guys too, for why some of the shifts that we've made over the past couple years. Of course, still making all the old classic beers that we've made in the past as well. In no way abandoning those. So hazy is a big one. I spent a lot of time on hazy because it really informs a lot of what we're doing today in beer. So this one's a little briefer, but the beer itself is one we're super duper excited about. Tropicoastal. This is the newest addition to the IPA family for us at Great Lakes. This one just came out August of this year. Nope, 2021. It's 2022. So it's only been out for half a year at most. And it's a little bit of that answer to the question of what's next in IPA from our perspective. So the specific tropical focus, and I'll explain how that's different from hazy in just a moment. So how many of you have tried Tropicoastal? Just curious. Hands? Got 2. You guys did we taste that at the tasting in December? Okay. Great. So I'm going to effectively say that nobody's tasted it, right? So you all should go ahead and try it. It is, of course, available wherever. I probably should stop saying that because you guys know that. But we're really excited about this one. I've been digging in a ton. I'll talk about sensory when we get to the end, but just quick intro, ABV 6%, low end of the spectrum for our IPA family. 60 IBU, it's a little bit higher than Hazecraft, so you will get some perceived bitterness in it. I don't think it's a particularly high level of bitterness, but compared to a hazy IPA, there's a little bit more in this one. I'll explain what that does sensory-wise in a little bit. Hops in this Idaho 7 Calypso and Strata, as well as Mosaic and Lemon Drop. You'll note that Mosaic and Lemon Drop were also in Hazecraft. Mosaic is almost like salt for us. It's in everything because it's really good. It's just one of the best hops out there. Lemon Drop's almost kind of become a pepper. And then the kind of fun feature hops are Idaho 7, Strata, and Calypso. And then malt, just the 2-row base malt for fermentables and little kiss of caramel 10 in there for a little bit of golden color. Just a couple notes on this one, because really tropical IPA, first of all, like I was saying, it's almost kind of like what we think the next step in IPA might be. So it doesn't have that much of a history yet, right? But the history that it does have it is very closely related with hazy IPAs. So according to my research, a couple beers start coming around in the late 2000s, right around 2010, that are specifically calling themselves tropical IPAs. So unrelated to the hazy IPAs, despite perhaps some shared sensory characteristics, but totally different area that these are popping up. And as you could imagine, these are popping up a lot more in the south. One really early example would be Cigar from Cigar City. I believe Cigar came out in 2009. I think that's when Cigar City started. And their brewmaster, Wayne Wambles, who we've collabed with in the past, really wanted to create a beer that embodied the tropical feel of Tampa Bay. And he did this through using the aforementioned relatively new hop varietals that were coming out, your Mosaics and Citras and things like that, along with some specialty malt sweetness. So talk about how that might differ from hazy IPA in just a little bit. So to kind of emulate, if you had a piece of tropical fruit and bit into it, it would have a little bit of sweetness to it naturally, right? So a little bit of that malt character is coming in to make the fruit notes seem even more natural. They're coming from the hops. So kind of a similar origin time period to the hazy IPAs, but a totally different place and a little bit of a different approach. I will be in Tampa Bay exactly 4 weeks from now. I can't wait. We go there. We go to St. Pete's technically, but I have plenty of High Ally when I'm down there. So it's a good beer, good brewery. Part of what kind of helps jumpstart this particular take, this kind of different take in the realm of tropical, is we see a lot of fruited IPAs in kind of the mid-2010s. And the big one that started that was Grapefruit Sculpin. You guys remember 2015, 2016, all of a sudden, like every single bar in Cleveland had Grapefruit Sculpin on. Sculpin, Ballast Point is from San Diego. The regular IPA is very good. Something about just the combination of, they came out as a summer seasonal originally, and where people's palates were evolving to, boom, fruited IPA like that blew up real quick. Wasn't necessarily sustained in the same way that some other styles have been, but what that did was generally start moving along a little bit more quickly, this trend of clear IPAs also moving into the tropical fruit flavor realm. Because Sculpin is a clear IPA, adding this extra fruit character helped spawn kind of other imitators. So Sierra Nevada, once again, came out with a tropical version of their Torpedo IPA, 2016. Tropical becomes one of the most used sensory descriptors for the IPA category as we get into 2017 and beyond. Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, a very good publication. Great writer, Kate Burnett, observing 2018 that tropical vibes are ruling pint classes from Portland, Maine, and Portland, Oregon. So we see tropical is really a common descriptor used for IPAs throughout the country. And based on our sales data in recent years, we've seen that beers that are described as tropical have kind of grown at the same overall relatively rapid pace that the IPA category generally has been growing, suggesting that it's part of what's driving the overall growth of the category. Now for us in particular, a beer that really inspired us with Tropicostal is Tropicalia from Creature Comforts down in Athens, Georgia. So again, it seems like a lot of these clear IPAs that are tropical fruit forward are coming from down south where it's a little warmer. Tropicalia for Creature Comforts just was a machine that they couldn't keep up with. It accelerated their business plan by about 2 years. Excellent liquid. I've tried it. I just had a pack sent up to me about a month ago, and it's delicious and definitely the same kind of thing that we're going for with Tropicoastal. So let's talk about the sensory for it. And it's really kind of similar in an overall approach to what a hazy IPA does, because of course we talked about how hazies have a lot of tropical fruit, but with some important differences. Appearance. Most of the time when you see a tropical IPA, and there's no mention of hazy or New England, it's going to be clear. So maybe a similar color and all that, head retention, but none of this haze, opacity, anything like that. really probably shouldn't have that same full mouth feel that a hazy IPA has. Think of where hazy IPAs come from. Vermont, way up north, super cold in the winter, all that kind of stuff. Big full body beer makes sense. Tropical IPAs come from the south, Florida and all that. You need something that's pretty crushable, relatively light bodied. You can have it in 115% humidity and all that. So you're not going to have that same full body that you got in a hazy IPA. It's going to be a lot lighter bodied, crisper, easier drinking. But then when it comes to other sensories, there's a lot of similarity in malt and so on. Of course, there's going to be a lot of tropical fruit forward flavors when it comes to the hop profile and so on. And then whereas a hazy had very low perceived bitterness, you're not guaranteed to have that in a tropical IPA. I would say that generally it's going to be a lower amount of bitterness, but compared to like old school IPAs, but there's still going to be some. Whereas there would be very low levels of that in the hazy. So that's more or less what you're getting with Tropicoastal. Tropicoastal note in the malts, it's the base malt, it's caramel 10. There's no oats, there's no wheat, nothing like that. You're going to end up with brilliantly clear beer, like what we have in the background of this picture. Just a little bit of golden glow coming from the caramel 10. And again, as I was kind of talking about before, that with Hyali at least, the caramel malt in Tropicoastal acts in the same way, where a little bit of sweetness from the caramel malt really makes those tropical fruit flavors coming from the hops feel even more juicy, like you're biting into real fruit, because there's that underpinning of sweetness. The big thing that I get personally when I'm sipping Tropicoastal, whereas there's like a lot of melon stuff going on in Hazecraft, I'm getting more like citric type tropical fruits in Tropicoastal, so I think pineapple big time, and then orange, lemon, things like that as well. Again, all that coming from the hop profile as opposed to anything additional added. So two different takes on a general similar realm. Tropical fruit flavors, but totally different kind of body, appearance, and so on. So two very distinct beers. That's a theme here we got 4-year-round IPAs. They can't all be tasting the same, right? So there's different ABV, IBU, different mouthfeel type character to all 4 of these beers. And then, of course, most importantly, some distinctions with regards to how the hops present themselves. Anything you guys are curious about right now, outside of questions about anything? Okay, cool.
I just had a question.
Mm-hmm.
Is this just in America, or is this around the world?
IPAs generally?
Yeah.
They're starting to be everywhere. We've kind of flipped the script now. So when American craft brewers started off, all of our original styles were inspired by the British and the Germans and so on. But then once you got to probably around the late 90s, early 2000s, we started, these beers are totally distinctly ours at that point. And we've continued to push the envelope so much with these styles that now brewers from other countries are starting to look at what's going on here and doing those styles abroad, which is pretty cool. So it's not quite the same level as here, but yeah, in Germany, England, countries all over, not even necessarily traditionally beer-focused cultures are starting to do what's essentially American craft beer styles in their own areas. So, and a lot of them are doing their own personal takes on, their own regional takes, incorporating local ingredients and so on as well. So, yeah. My wife's from Peru, and we went down there in 2015, and we went to Machu Picchu right away and stuff. So we're going from Cusco down through the Sacred Valley to Machu Picchu, and there's a craft brewery in the Sacred Valley on the way to Machu Picchu. I'm like, you serious? That's how far craft beer has gone. Yeah, it's out there. All right, that's really the meat. Those 2 beers are the ones we're super excited about, but of course we got to talk about our long-standing English IPA and mention our American IPA as well for you all. Now we're kind of taking that step back. We just talked about the present. This is kind of like the historical, and I don't want to go too deep here to be within time and everything, but there's a little bit of the history of how we got to where we are right now with hazies and tropical and all that kind of stuff. So, Commodore Perry. There is a myth out there, and some of you may have heard this myth before, that IPA was invented by one guy named George Hodgson at a specific brewery, like on a specific day or something like that, because the beer that was being shipped from England to colonies all over, but especially the colony of India, was spoiling on the journey. And my guy, Martin Cornell here, very sharp English beer historian, brings up the pesky fact that there is no written evidence that that is the case. So let me tell you why this myth is wrong. Bust this myth for you. Primary sources, right? Such a pesky thing. Great thing to talk about at a library. So what we know based on brewing logs and things like that, pale ale is a distinct style by the early 1700s. British beer generally is making its way to India by the 1710s. Pale ale specifically is being exported to India later in that century. However, combating the myth that this guy invented IPA distinctly, oh, and by the way, part of the thing about inventing IPA is to prevent the beer from spoiling, he upped the hop rate and upped the ABV. The hops and alcohol are both natural preservatives. Well, it would be tough for him to have invented that because everybody else was already doing that for decades before he started selling his beer. So it's true with all other beer styles too. If you were making a porter and you were shipping it to, say, the United States, because there are a lot of colonists there who love porter, you were brewing it to a higher alcohol content and hopping it to a higher rate. That's not exclusive to pale ales. So up till the 1820s, pale ale export was concentrated in London for natural reasons, big time, the biggest port city in England. And this guy Hodgson, no doubt, did have a very strong business. He was brewing a lot of pale ale and he was exporting a lot of it to other countries, including India, although it wasn't necessarily because it was good. It was more because of some maybe slightly shady business practices. But there's the development throughout the 19th century, generally of industrialization, specifically of railroads, kind of starts to flip the script for where IPAs, well, at this time they're really just called pale ales, where the concentration of pale ale production is happening, and it shifts to Burton, and Burton is right there. Tough to export a lot of beer when you're inland, but if you got a railroad to get that beer real fast to Liverpool, then you're good to go. And that's exactly what happens. Burton in the 1830s overtakes London as the hub of pale ale brewing for a number of different reasons, some of them historical. There's a Russian ban on British imports in the early 1820s, and Burton had been shipping a lot of a very strong, thick, viscous beer called Burton ale, kind of like a barley wine. They had been shipping that to Russia. And now these Burton brewers need to start making something else. And so they start making, because now they have better access to ports to do fresher beers like pale ales, they start focusing on those a little bit more. Conveniently enough, the one English beer style that the Russians did not ban was porter. They really love porters and stouts. And so the London brewers who had started to lose out on pale ale production shifted quickly to porter and stout, Russian Imperial Stout, right, and started shipping that off to Catherine the Great. So I guess it was a win-win for the two cities. Maybe one of the biggest reasons for why pale ales really took off in Burton was because of the water quality of the city. Very high in a mineral called sulfate. Sulfate is a chemical that's going to accentuate hop character. It's going to make it seem crisper, drier, and in no way harsh. And so pale ale simply tasted better when it was being brewed in Burton because of the water content. Especially because some of the London brewers weren't exactly making great pale ale anyways. It's no surprise that very quickly pale ale production gets concentrated in Burton. Now this all forces our friend, Mr. George Hodgson, to turn to the clever trick called marketing to try to recoup some of his lost business, right? Because maybe he had some relationships for porter, but not as much as pale ale. And it is around this time, we're talking in the 1820s, 1830s, that he starts calling his beer India Pale Ale, although maybe somebody had already been calling his beer India Pale Ale before that. One way or the other, for whatever reason, Hodgson is the one who popularizes the term India Pale Ale for this kind of beer. And of course, it's India Pale Ale because this product is specifically going to India. And then because of Hodgson's continued success branding his beer as India Pale Ale, a lot of other English brewers start calling their beer IPA as well. So this guy Hodgson did not invent, really did not invent IPA, right? He gets a lot of credit for it, but in reality, you know, shrewd business guy, nothing wrong with that. Didn't really invent a beer style. But if you go almost anywhere, that's the story that you will hear, right? Now you know the truth. In England, IPA becomes popular for a couple decades, and then it overtakes Porter as the #1 beer style in England. Porter dominated England for a century and a half. But because of a lot of various other cultural and governmental reasons, IPA really becomes a shell of its former self. So we see, of course, the world wars have a huge effect on production of all kinds of goods. ABV levels plummet because of rationing of barley. Temperance movement also drives alcohol content down across the board in England as well as here in the States. The government starts taxing brewers on the original gravity of their beer. That's the amount of sugar that's in the liquid before fermentation. So what do brewers do? Less of that, less taxes, right? And then just generally, those pesky Pilsners are starting to make their way into England at this point, and people really like those crisp, refreshing Pilsners. So IPA really becomes something totally different. It's really not IPA anymore, and essentially disappears from England in the early 20th century. But thankfully, someone comes to the rescue, and we'll talk about that for our last beer. So overall, what is an English IPA? This might be really, at this point in time, English IPA might be the most different of the 4 beers that we're talking about here today. It's going to have more malt character. It's going to be deeper in color, probably at minimum golden, but maybe approaching amber. In the grand scheme of things, still pale, but maybe not quite as pale as some of the other takes. It's going to be clear. This is the classic take. Although if you have some dry hopping going on, especially if it's a cask beer, maybe there'll be a little bit of haze, but generally they should be clear. Still overall, you know, moderate body, relatively smooth. Yes, it's very hoppy and bitter. Shouldn't be astringent. Generally speaking, good amount of carbonation, which is really going to help dry out the overall mouthfeel. This is probably the driest of the 4 different IPA styles that we're looking at. Especially if you had a super classic English IPA that sat in a cask for 6 months before it got to India, it'd be extremely dry. Just like in appearance, unlike the other beer styles that we've talked about, there is going to be some malt character to this beer. Caramel, toast, biscuit, toffee. You don't have to have those things, but if they're there, that's not considered a flaw in any way. They'd be very welcome. And then the kind of hop character, if you're getting a true, real deal English IPA that's using English hops, it's going to have, as opposed to the American citrus and tropical fruit and stone fruit and all that, it's going to be more floral, spicy, peppery. I see orange marmalade, specifically orange marmalade for some reason a lot, so that could very specific sensory trigger for you. And they tend to have relatively high levels of bitterness across the board. A lot of these IPAs kind of have the similar range of mid-5s ABV to mid-7s, so there you go. IBUs in the 40 to 60 type range and so on. Now Commodore Perry, you'll note it's on the high end of the range, right? So Commodore Perry is 7.7 ABV and 70 IBU. That is just above the range that's suggested by BJCP. But this would be a great example of how American craft brewers take an existing traditional style and just do a little bit more with it than was traditionally done. That's the case across the board, all the way going back to Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. They took English Pale Ale and just amped it up a little bit with American ingredients. Caramel 30 in Commodore Perry. So remember, Tropicostal was the caramel 10. That number indicates the grade of crystal malt. And the higher you go, the darker it's going to be, the more flavor you're going to get from it. So a little bit of a deeper copper color to Commodore Perry because of that, a little bit more of that malt character as well. And then more old school American hops are going to be used. We don't import English hops, we'll use American hops that are going to approximate that English hop profile. So Simcoe, which we use in a lot of our beers as well. Willamette, which is related to the Fuggle hop from England, and Cascade, the classic West Coast kind of grapefruity forward hop. Commodore Perry himself was the hero of the Battle of Lake Erie during the War of 1812. Pulled a very bold maneuver to win that particular battle and became quite famous for it. Of course, there are many, many different things named for Oliver Hazard Perry up in the Sandusky region. Perhaps the finest middle name in all of human history, right there, Hazard, right? And he had a famous battle cry, "Don't give up the ship." And we very wittily modified it to "Don't give up the sip," because we have a zero waste policy at Great Lakes. So, Perry's been out since '92. So in this last beer we're about to talk about, it's really, for all intents and purposes, also very new. Great Lakes IPA was 2019, Hazecraft was 2020, Tropicoastal was 2021. So up until 2019, we're a modern American craft brewer at Great Lakes, where, I'll mention at the end here, like IPAs are almost 50% of all craft beer sold. Up until 2019, we had one. So that's why we've obviously been making up for some lost time with coming out with a lot of IPAs over the past couple years, because it's what the people want, right? Sales numbers speak for themselves. The Great Lakes IPA, this is American IPA. So we went way back in history for English IPA, and now we're kind of talking about what led up to the tropical hazy realm that we're in right now with American IPAs. In the States, we actually did have some IPA production before the craft beer movement. Of course, first people who immigrated into this country were English, and the first group of English people who were coming were bringing porters. But then if you were immigrating to the States in the mid-19th century, then you were probably bringing some IPAs with you. And one of those guys would have been Peter Ballantyne. Scotsman, he was a brewer in his home country, so he practiced the same trade here and brewed a true style, English IPA here in the United States, 7.5%, aggressively hopped and so on. This is one of the rare ale styles that survived Prohibition. Of course, just after guys like Ballantyne would have made it here, a lot of the Germans came over with their lager beer as well, and those really took hold, of course, in this country. But Ballantyne did survive all the way up until kind of like the 80s. It was still, my understanding, is that it was still in more or less its original form into the 60s and 70s. And so a lot of the early craft brewers had Ballantyne IPA, and was like, light bulb went off. There's something here that's different from most of the other stuff that's out there, and that's the kind of stuff that we want to make. These would have been guys like Burt Grant up at Yakima Brewing in Washington State, who took the English IPA and said, I live literally in hop country. Why would I use hops from England for India Pale Ale when I can use these very expressive Cascade and Chinook hops that are literally grown in my backyard? And that was really the template that early American craft brewers used for developing their own identity for their beers, was inspired by the traditional styles, but using American ingredients and with an American attitude as well, where everything's a little bit more, like I was talking about with Perry. And brewers all up and down the West Coast start brewing this version of India Pale Ale using American ingredients. Fritz Maytag. There's a brewer I mention almost as often as Sierra Nevada. It is Anchor, who was kind of first in everything. So mid-1970s, they come out with Liberty Gale. Today, we would probably call that a pale ale. It actually might be kind of similar to Burning River, but in 1975, it was pretty hop forward. It would have been considered an IPA, right around 6% pale malt, using Cascade hops, that kind of proto-American hop that's super grapefruity. Of course, here they are again. Note that the only style I didn't mention Sierra Nevada in was English IPA, because Sierra Nevada didn't open until 1980. So that's probably the only reason why I didn't mention that. Ken Grossman of Sierra, of course, initially famous for the pale ale, but he wanted to brew a beer to celebrate the hop harvest. Hop harvest happens towards the end of summer into early fall. And when you're using fresh hops that have been recently harvested and dried out, they just have a little extra something to them, but extra green quality, herbaceous quality, a little bit more oomph to the essential oils and so on. So he brewed an IPA to celebrate the hop harvest called Celebration. Looking a little bit more like what we would expect in an IPA to be today. So 6.8 ABV, 65 IBUs, using, again, a lot of those classic American hops, Chinook, Cascade, Centennials. A lot of the early American hops all happen to start with C, so you'll see them called the C hops a lot. Tons of citrus and pine, all those fresh hop characteristics. This really might be the first example of what we today would recognize as an IPA. Whereas Liberty Ale is really more of a pale ale today, this is still very much an IPA. One of my favorite seasonals, when I'm asked, what's your favorite beer, and I'm not answering Great Lakes stuff, this is probably one of my top 3. I had my last one on Sunday, and it was so sad, because it's seasonal, obviously. So, West Coast. IPA starts moving to the East Coast in the kind of mid-later 90s. Harpoon, again, I went to school in Boston, so fond of Harpoon. They have a pretty solid IPA. Maybe kind of similar to the Liberty Ale in some ways. Not super high IBU, again around 6% ABV, but what's important is that we started seeing IPA produced on the East Coast as well. It originates on the West, starts to move to the East. So it's starting to become a national phenomenon. By the time we were getting to the late 90s, a lot of the IPAs that had been produced up to this point might have been one-off, seasonal, something like that. Stone releases what they claim, and I think they may be right, it was the first truly year-round IPA with their just classic Stone West Coast IPA, which was originally brewed as their first anniversary beer in '97, had enough popularity despite at that time in the late 90s still really being more or less an extreme beer, but popular enough that they decided to make it a year-round offering starting in 1998. So probably one of, if not the first, American IPAs sold year-round. And then that really opens up the floodgates, but when you get into the 2000s and beyond, I mentioned one of the biggest driving factors for American brewers is pushing the envelope, doing more, creating new things, right? So they say they go from pale ale to IPA, or from English IPA, make it more aggressive with American ingredients, up the ABV and the IBUs. That's not enough. Let's do super high ABV, 8-9% crazy bitterness. That's double IPA or Imperial IPA. Let's throw in some dark malts in there, black IPA, a little bit of a coffee chocolate thing going on with the hops. Let's ferment with Belgian yeast instead of American yeast to get some peppery phenols coming from the fermentation. Kind of mentioned fruited IPA before. American hops taste citrusy. Let's throw some actual fruit in there. Let's do the opposite of what we did earlier. Let's make a lower ABV IPA. So still the aggressive hop character that you get in IPA, but a more digestible alcohol content. And then, of course, the hazy and tropical IPAs that we have already mentioned. And we haven't looked back since, right? I really need to find a newer chart because this one's a little dated, but it shows the trajectory that we've been on since American craft beer really started to take off and establish itself right around 2010. It's been very much driven by the IPA style, and the growth rate of IPA has continued. Just imagine those bars just keep getting taller, right? Taller and taller as we get into 2021 and 2022. IPA is pretty much what people think of when they think of American craft beer. I can remember just the shift in hanging out at various tap rooms. And I remember around probably like 2014, 2015, I'd be sitting at the bar and people would come up behind and ask, lead question is, what do you have? What's your latest offering? What's the latest beer you have on tap? And then it just started clicking like around 2019, 2020, those same people were now coming in saying, what are your IPAs? And like, you weren't asking that 5 years ago, So there's been a definitive shift where like, this is what people think of when they think of craft beer. And again, these numbers, haven't been able to find a good chart to show more recent growth, but we've continued on a rapid growth rate over the past 5 years. And I think at the end of last year, like IPAs are probably like 42-43% of overall dollar sales for craft beer. So if you wonder why we just spent a little bit over an hour talking about IPAs and why you see brewers like us coming out with 3 new IPAs in 3 years and so on, it's because drinkers in the United States are totally obsessed with the style, brewers are totally obsessed with the style, and pushing the envelope and becoming ever more creative with it. And we just couldn't miss out on all that fun, right? So here we are. To wrap it up, Century for this American IPA kind of straddles the line between, it's the bridge between the English IPA and the hazies and tropicals and all that. So maybe a similar color a little bit to what's going on with an English IPA, maybe even a little bit of a similar mouthfeel. Probably not quite as dry, but still relatively dry. But big shift is, whereas the English IPA, you would expect some malt character, where we have shed that by the time we get to American IPA. Maybe a little bit of caramel toast, but not in any significant quality and not in any significant quantity like you would expect with the English IPAs. And of course, by the time you get to what we're making today, you really don't want any of that caramel toast or anything. And then when it comes to hops, you know, you can have some of the tropical stuff, stone fruit and so on. You could have the more old school where it's floral, piney, resinous and so on. So make sure you have a lot of it, a lot of hop character, probably gonna be a solid amount of bitterness in this take, and so on. Similar specs you can kind of see again. Obviously, the original American IPAs are very much inspired directly by the English IPA, so we see similar specifications, just a little bit higher on ABV and IBU. So Great Lakes IPA is what best fits into the American IPA category for us. See, it's at 6.5 ABV, 50 IBU, interestingly lower than Tropicoastal. If you remember before, Tropicoastal was 60. However, in Great Lakes IPA, it's just the base malt. There's no caramel malt or anything like that in there. So personally, I got a similar bitterness presentation, despite the difference in IBUs, because there's very little to balance out the bitterness going on in Great Lakes IPA. Again, neither are aggressive or out of control, but you will notice some bitterness. Really makes it a little bit more drinkable and refreshing. And does anyone remember the hops that were in Hazecraft? It's those same 4 hops. So, but what's so interesting, if you had those 2 beers side by side, they would taste totally different hop-wise. Because of course, it's not just the kinds of hops you're using, how much of them are you using, when are you using them in the brewing process, so on and so forth. So I think it's really cool that we get a totally different kind of hop presentation in these 2 beers that use the 4 same hops because of when they're used, how much of them are used, and so on. This is a little bit more of the classic. It doesn't have a ton of malt character, essentially just being the base malt, but then it's got kind of the more grapefruity and almost like a little bit of dank type quality going on from the specific hops that we use. And this beer is just simply named for the Great Lakes. Named the brewery after the Great Lakes, figure we'd name a beer after them too. This was a fun one. Originally it was, I don't remember when this beer first came out, we had a set of various employees on the label, which is really cool for us, but nobody had any idea who they were. So we did. And it's a great story to tell on a tour. Come down to the brewery and take a tour, and we'll tell you all about our employee ownership. But for something, a label on a can, something expressing the identity of our region made a lot more sense. You got the cardinal on there, which is the state bird of Ohio, and like 4 other states that are in our distribution footprint. So we got some mileage with that one right there. All right, that's all I had for you all. Do we have any closing questions before we wrap up about anything that you all are curious about? Yes?
I know years ago, my husband and I went through a tour you had.
Mm-hmm.
Are you kind of still doing those?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're doing tours. You can sign up for a tour this weekend. Fridays and Saturdays. This time of year, we tend to do just Friday evening, all day Saturday, and I think they're doing 1 tour on Sunday. So greatlakesbrewing.com/tours and classes. That should get you to the sign-up page for tours. I also do stuff like this out of the brewery where we get to taste the beer. Nice. So same link for that, greatlakesbrewing.com/tours and classes. There's a Beer 101 up, I think it's next week. I'm not teaching that one. The rest of my team's teaching that one. But I think it's next Wednesday. So check out the website, Beer 101. So it'd probably be similar to what we did back in December. So if you weren't at that one, check it out. And you get glassware from that too. So there's a special tour pint glass that you get with the tour. There's some specific hop college. That's what we call the extended classes. It's like a snifter, a tulip glass, all sorts of other fun stuff. Brew pub's back open Saturday or Wednesday through Sunday for lunch and dinner, except no dinner on Sunday. And of course, brewery's cranking, so you'll find the beer all over the place. Other questions? Whatever. Yeah.
What's the future for these other styles of beers if the IPAs are taking off so much?
Yeah, so for a brewery like us, we're making a lot more IPA, but other traditional styles, at least for us, those other traditional styles are still extremely important. Last year, 2020 and 2021, we actually saw a big swing back to beers like Dortmunder and Edmund Fitzgerald and Elliot Ness and stuff because of people are just going to for obvious reasons, going to tap rooms less and stuff like that, and like maybe in certain financial situations they came back to those tried and true brands, right? So, and then when it comes to like our seasonal line is huge. Obviously Christmas ale is totally nuts, but Oktoberfest for us is a major part of our business, and Conway's, which is out right now, the Irish ale. Yes, it's St. Patrick's Day beer, but you can drink it for 2 months before St. Patrick's Day as well, right? So it's just an Irish beer, Irish all year, right? So, but that's a seasonal for the first quarter. So those beers, those traditional styles are still really important for us too. For a business, for like the industry overall, you're always going to find them. That's the beauty of our little buddies who run their own small places, is that people go there for the experience, less so than I want to drink 7 IPAs or whatever. So like I can go to Noble Beast and I know I can have a Kolsch or a Czech Pilsner and stuff like that. But on a bigger scale, you'll just see less of those, I think, but they'll still be around here and there. Yeah, and keep homebrewing them. Right? That's the best way to make sure they keep going.
Yeah, Kolsch is super easy to homebrew.
Yeah.
Like in the part of the year, because Kolsch is so sort of summer oriented or whatever, like you stop seeing it for about September, so you have to make it yourself.
That's right. Yep. A lot less Kolsch, but Kolsch should be around all the time. Yep. And it's an ale, so whip it up pretty quick. So, other questions? Yes.
Anything else new coming up at Great Lakes Brewing that you should know about that would lead
Yeah.
us to come visit you?
Mm-hmm. So for the brewery itself, we will be having some events coming up in February and beyond. Haven't done a ton of we're just starting to get that planning stuff done because, for 3 weeks we're like, oh, can we do anything or not? But it looks like we're okay. So stay tuned to the website and social media and stuff for brewery-specific stuff. Campus, I should say, specific stuff. But then for the year ahead on the production side, we came out with a lot of new beers over the past 2 years. 3 IPAs, as well as the Crushworthy Citrus Wheat, which came out in March in 2020. Happens to be low calorie, so it's a better for you option and all that. It's also fresh, natural fruit flavor, orange and lemon, very sessionable at 4%. Even have a seltzer floating around out there right now called Agave Twist. It's based on a ranch water, which is agave alongside the flavorings and all that. So this year we're not doing as much new stuff, but we are doing some fun stuff to kind of just put some twists on that stuff. So Crushworthy is going to be a variety pack for Crushworthy in the summer, where it's going to have the regular Crushworthy, and then it's going to have versions with grapefruit, lemon lime, and watermelon. So that'll be a really fun summer pack. I mentioned the Imperial Ipa Series. So last year we still had the first release of last year in our specialty pack was the Beer Wolf, Dunkelweizen. Great beer. It's not an Imperial IPA, right? So Beer Wolf went back to his cave and is hibernating, and we have a new Imperial Grapefruit IPA that will be out in June. It's in June, called Ruby's Revenge, and it's got a crazy piranha plant grapefruit on it, kind of like Little Shop of Horrors. So that'll be a fun one. But those are really only the 2 new beers we have coming out this year. But nobody in this room has had Tropicoastal yet. So like we still gotta, you know, spread the word about the stuff we came out with last year too. So got some exciting new stuff, making sure people know about the cool new stuff that we had coming out over the past year too. Cool. Anything else? Yeah? All right, thanks everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks people on the camera. Hello. We'll see you soon.